Okay, third and final line that I'll be talking about today. I think the key to getting these three lines together for me has been the love of repetition, the love of learning. And in our culture in general, we don't have a deep appreciation for what it means to learn. We associate knowledge with information that you don't necessarily even need to memorize or remember or hold on to. But snippets of information equals knowledge. And I think we don't really appreciate, unless we really do this practice, we don't really appreciate the importance of repeating something again and again and again. My training in repetition didn't come from Buddhism initially. It came from swimming and practicing daily in a pool where you had to go back and forth. You used to do a flip turn at every wall and keep going. Flip, flip, flip. And I remember reading the book Siddhartha. Do you know that book? It was my first introduction to Buddhism. 11th grade, I was 15, 16 years old, and I'd never heard of Buddhism before that. I never heard the name Siddhartha. On the cover of the book of Siddhartha, it was I remember it being a blue book, and there was a Buddha statue on that cover. And I'd never seen a Buddha statue before. And I was really interested in it, but I didn't know. But then I started reading it, and somehow I had a innate kind of feeling for it, appreciation for it. And I remember reading about some part where the Buddha was sitting in a cave or something, practicing meditation, and we were discussing the book in class. This was an 11th grade English class. Honors English class, and I said to the teacher, wouldn't that be kind of boring just to sit and follow your breathing? And one of my classmates, Cliff, he was a former swimmer at that time. He had given up, and he said to me, and this was after I'd been swimming pretty much every day, twice a day, sometimes 4 hours a day. And he looked over at me, Cliff looked over at me, and said, "Yeah, Eric, kind of like swimming." And I was first a little bit offended, but then I thought afterwards, it's exactly the same. Whatever you want to become good at, you've got to repeat it. You've got to repeat it again and again and again. We can't rest on an intellectual understanding of it. You can't play the piano once and say, "I'm all done, I got it." You got to keep practicing it. You got to keep your hands on and keep going at it. Or like my teacher would say, if you want to start a fire, you've got to keep rubbing two sticks together. And if you stop, you don't get a fire. You got to do it until you start to get a fire. So we have to develop this appreciation for repetition. I think if we want to, because any sutra you look at, there's going to be loads of repetition. And this is hard for our minds, really. We want our minds to be like rubber bands, right? There's a stretchiness. Rubber bands, if they're too old, they break, they're brittle. Or if you put them in the freezer, you take them out of the freezer and then they're all wonky until they warm up. And I think our rubber band mind has been in the freezer too long. We've been given the gift of the internet and constant exposure to any kind of information we want. And we got to take our rubber band our mental rubber band out of the freezer, let it warm up, and return its plasticity, its flexibility. Because every sutra we read, we're going to come across a kind of a circular way of thinking. And if we don't have that flexibility, we're going to become bored. Isn't it boring? And it's okay to be bored, but if you use that boredom as an excuse for not practicing, if it if that boredom becomes the reason for not practicing, then we're missing something out. We're missing out on something. Because if you keep on practicing, even with the boredom, something will shift, something will change. And joy will inevitably arise. I remember times when I would be swimming back and forth. We would do these 3,000 yards at once. You know, my coach would say, okay, we're going to do, our practice today is going to be doing 3,000 yards. That would be basically, 120 laps in a 25-yard pool. Go ahead and do 120 laps without stopping. What are you doing? You're going back and forth and back and forth. And you're entering into this hanya, the wisdom, the letting go of concepts. So sometimes I remember times I didn't know if I was going or coming. You do so many flip turns, you lose count. You know, that's why if you're doing a race, you always, if you're doing a race over 200 yards or 200 meters, you always have a counter. You have somebody putting in the water how many yards, where you're at, so you can keep track of it. Because the mind, when you do that kind of repetition, the mind loses track. And I remember also studying religion. This is even before I really got into Buddhism. One of my religion professors, John Grimm, he said to me, when you're writing, because I was working with him on a thesis on interreligious dialogue, and he said to me, when you're writing, don't look at the clock. Don't look at the clock. It's going to mess you up. He didn't say it was going to mess you up. He said, don't look at the clock. All right? Do it, just write, without thinking about the time. That was invaluable to hear that from him. What we do, we think about the clock, we think about the time, and it just messes us up. There is no such thing as time. That's a human fabrication. And so that's why it's helpful to sit a sesshin, because you're sitting and sitting and sitting, and you'll see your tendencies to want to look at time and quantify it in some way. But sesshin is an opportunity to let go of that human construct and just be in the moment more fully. It's like going from swimming on top of the ocean to diving down deep where there's no air, and being totally immersed in reality. So that's all by way of introducing this third line. Since the Buddha way by nature goes beyond the dualities of abundance and deficiency, there is arising and perishing delusion and realization, living beings and Buddhas. So this takes us back to the beginning, to the first line.
It's a negation of the negation, isn't it?
It's a kind of negation of the negation, yeah. We could say it like that. So we need to put the concepts back on reality. My teacher would say, when you do sesshin, you take the labels off of things. But when you leave the sesshin, you need to put the labels back on. A green light means a green light, and a red light means a red light. You can't, but be careful, because if you've really done this practice, red does not necessarily mean stop. That's a mental construct. Red is just red. And if you're in your car and you're not paying attention and you look at red and you don't realize red is red, you might get yourself into an accident. So for your own health and well-being, we put the constructs back on. We have to return to the conceptual world and the conceptual way of thinking. Lots of special, quote unquote, special experiences could happen during meditation, whether you're sitting for a long time or a short time. Or even if you're not sitting at all, you might have some kind of a special enlightening experience, a little E enlightenment experience. But this part of the practice is saying, don't get caught. Don't get caught by those emptiness type experiences where there's no Buddhas and no living beings, no delusion and don't get caught by those experiences and think that you've got something now. Dogen's, one of his big questions, his central question to practice, he says, if all beings are essentially Buddha, what's the point of practicing? Why bother practicing? And this is our question, I think, as well. If we have that question, and we don't really pursue it, then we won't continue, we won't do it. It won't make any sense because we're still up in this part of the head. We're still thinking, we're still intellectualizing the practice. To say, why do I need to practice, is coming at it from the place of delusion. When we say, if I'm to say, why do I practice? It's coming from a place of delusion. And yet I'll ask that question sometimes. I'll ask that, why am I practicing? That's coming from a place of delusion. It's the Buddha that is practicing. The Buddha practices, the universe practices. And I want to be a part of that. I'm part of something much bigger. And that's why I practice. It's not why am I practicing. That's coming from the place of delusion. So we come from the place of realization. It's the Buddhas that practice. It's the whole universe that practices, and I'm joining them. And I want to be awake. I want to be awake to that experience. Right? Well, I mean, it's wonderful. We're not alone. That's what the Buddha realized upon his awakening, that he was never going to be alone again. Right? Even if he's by himself, he's never alone. Even if we're by ourselves, loneliness, such a deep experience of so many of us in a culture that is highly hyper-individual. Loneliness is a big problem. What if we realize we're never alone? So another way of thinking about these three lines, putting them together, there's a Zen saying. When we first come to practice, mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers. Maybe some of you have heard this already. When we practice, when we put effort into practice, we realize that mountains are not mountains, rivers are not rivers. This is taking the concepts off. The labels come off of objects. There's no separation between self and others. This is the emptiness teachings. There's no boundary between self and other. The butterfly and the person, the grass and our eyes. When we continue to practice, mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers. Right? It's this circular way of being. So we need to go through that full circle, where mountains are mountains are not mountains are mountains again. But the third one, where mountains are mountains, is not the same as the first one, where mountains are mountains. The first one, where mountains are mountains, is coming from a place of delusion. The second time mountains are mountains, after you've had realization, then those mountains are mountains, is coming from a place of realization. You can't stay in these emptiness teachings. We have to continue to live in the world. And there will be times when we let go of conceptualizing things and enter into the place of no realization and no Buddhas, no delusion, no enlightenment. But then we've got to return again and again. It's about this repetition. We've got to have a mind that appreciates repetition. When we see non-duality for ourselves, when we realize non-duality for ourselves, this is a tremendous step towards developing faith. A real faith, not a blind faith, but a real faith in the practice. And this is also a mode of being in the world. Faith is a mode of being, and it's something that's very lacking in our very secularly oriented culture. We doubt everything. We're the culture, the generation of skeptics. And so faith is a countermeasure to that predominant, prevailing attitude of skepticism that we can't do anything. It's too late. It's too late to do anything. Right? it's too late to save others. It's too late to save the world. That's a predominant view, and I see it all of the time in my world, in the community college classes amongst the youth. People have given up on this the idea that we can. I see it written directly in front of me. It's already too late to do anything. The world is already in shambles. This is exactly the kind of attitude that was prevailing around the time of Dogen. And that's what the Shobo Genzo is a response to. In the Buddhist cosmology, there was this idea in Buddhist cosmology that we lived in these 4 periods of existence. The true Dharma, which is when the Buddha was alive, and then the artificial Dharma, the Dharma starts to wane, and it gets worse. You can't really even hear the Dharma. It's so far removed from the Buddha, the time of the Buddha, that you can't even hear the Buddha's teachings anymore without a lot of effort. And then there's this period called Mappo, where you're so far removed from the Buddha's teachings, it's impossible to attain enlightenment. And so you get the development of various schools of Buddhism that say, you don't need to practice, you don't need to meditate, just put your palms together and recite the name of the Buddha or recite the name of the Lotus Sutra. All fine practices, and I'm not critiquing those practices, but they developed because of this attitude that said, we are in an age where it's the degradation of the Dharma. It can't be heard by our particular time. And Dogen's response was counter to that. He wrote what was called the Shobo Genzo. The Shobo means the true Dharma eye. That this period that we're living in is the period of the true Dharma. It's the period of time when the Buddha lived. It's not separate from the time that the Buddha lived. And we can wake up. We can wake up through practice. So once we have the experience of non-duality, that awakens faith. That awakens faith in us that we can do something about this life, about this. We can change things. We can end suffering. We can create environments that are healthier than they are right now. All right. That's the gift here.